The Reaper Effect by Zed Blood Queen. The Mass Effect series has always been one of my favorites. With an emphasis on player choice and a character that travels through all three games with you, it was unique and pulled off many things that other games usually fail at. After I finished the final game along with a bit of the DLC, I was beyond upset at the ending. It didn't fit the character and actually left me with far more questions than answers. Apparently I was visibly upset. I will admit, I do tend to get overly invested in certain games. A close friend of mine asked me what had made me so angry. I assured him it was nothing, but seeing as we share an apartment, he knows me far better than that. Fully aware that my involvement and attachment to certain games makes gaming a guilty pleasure of mine, he sat down and demanded to know what was wrong. I gave in to his demands for an answer and recounted all that had made me so upset. It was a silly matter, but it felt amazing to tell someone about my frustrations. At the end of my tale, he was very interested in the trilogy. I was amazed at this. My friend always had issues with the differences between reality and fantasy due to acute schizophrenia. As a result of this, he never interacts with immersive things like movies, television shows, or video games. It was only recently that he could read a good book and not lose touch with reality. With him being 24 and finally getting some sort of grip on his illness, I figured that I could tell him more about it and not have to worry too much. So long as I was careful with what I told him, of course. I explained the overarching plot and the different ways you can create Shepard, the main character, as well as how the player can interact with their world. At the end of our conversation, I was somewhat worried. He seemed far too interested in the games. But after all was said and done, he dropped the topic. Weeks went by, and I kept a very careful eye on him to make sure that I hadn't made a mistake. A few months passed, and the concern began to fade from my mind. A few more weeks went by, and he came home with the complete Mass Effect trilogy. I reminded him that I owned all the games, but he told me that the box set was on sale and it came with all of the DLC, most of which I didn't own. I was a bit hesitant, but conceded that he had a good reason that he bought the series. We sat down and I helped him through the early levels of the game. I was surprised at how quickly he picked up the game's mechanics and how easily he moved through the world. It took us nearly a month to finish the first game since I kept insisting on taking long breaks in between playing sessions. Though he would whine at first, the game didn't seem to dominate his thoughts. The day before we would play again, he would get excited, but I couldn't really blame him. I had played through the series so many times I had completely lost count. After we beat the first game, there was another period of rest before we started the second. Halfway through the next game, my schoolwork demanded more and more of my attention. We had an agreement that he could play while I was home, and while I was in the room with him. I didn't want to stop him from playing the games since they made him so happy, and he could step back into reality when the console turned off, but I didn't want him to play unsupervised. I felt like a bit of an ass treating him like a child and all, but I reminded myself that it was what needed to be done. It took nearly 2 months to finish, though the time on the game file showed that it had been beaten in record time. Finals week was drawing near and I found myself without any free time to play with him. I could continue to sit in on his sessions, but the game's audio would soon distract me from my studies. To my great relief, my friend started new medications for his illness that, according to his doctor, should be able to help him fully separate reality from fantasy. The drug was only a trial, but my friend was assured that, in time, he would be able to better manage his illness. Though he was no longer taking his original meds, he was informed that the lingering effects of his old medication may cause an effect of the new pills to take some time to show themselves. This meant he didn't need to be micromanaged every time the TV was on, or he wanted to read a book or go out and see a movie with his friends. Assuaged by this new knowledge, I let him play his game after he had a few weeks to adjust to his new medications. Through our many conversations, I gathered that he was taking much longer to play this game. He's moving through the galaxies very methodically, carefully inspecting each planet, ensuring that he had every war asset. One morning I noticed he had a little less color in his face. There were faint dark marks under his eyes, as though he hadn't slept much. I asked him what was going on, and he said that the medications were messing up his sleep schedule. He explained that he had talked to his doctor, and was told that only time would fix the problem. He then said that he'd been playing the final Mass Effect game to help him sleep. Now, very alert, I asked if it was the wisest thing to do. He told me that his doctor said there should be no ill effect from playing the game, even on little sleep. Continuing, he said that his doctor urged him to fall asleep by any means, besides taking any kind of medication that would react badly with the medicine he was taking for his illness. A bit apprehensive, I made my friend promise that he would go easy on the game until his body balanced out. He agreed, and I left for my classes. I returned home late and found my friend sitting on the front room couch curled up into a corner piece. All of the lights were off and he was entranced by the television. After much work, I finally got him to bed. He wasn't angry that I made him stop playing as he was in past episodes of his illness. He was more worried and anxious. He kept muttering, "Am I being indoctrinated?" Glancing around nervously as I put him to bed, he asked that I turn on his nightlight, a trinket from his childhood that helped him rest when his mind wasn't at ease. I wished him good night, turned on the tiny lamp, and left him. I wasn't too worried about his reaction. Once I realized I was being indoctrinated, I had flipped out. You get attached to your character over the games, and it's not something you want to see. The next morning, his face had a bit less color and he was glancing around nervously. Before I had the chance to ask him what was wrong, he fixed an insane stare on me and asked in a hushed voice, "Am I being indoctrinated?" I paused for a moment before I thought of where in the game he had stopped the night before. In the third Mass Effect game, your character is slowly indoctrinated by enemy forces, the Reapers. After a brief moment of thought, I realized what I hadn't the night before, why the indoctrination would worry him so much. It would hit very close to home for him. With his past of getting lost in fantasy, he now faced his character's mind slowly being taken over. It was far too similar a parallel. We took an hour or so to talk over what was happening in the game and what would happen by the end. His spirit somewhat lifted by learning of the game's ending, and the color had returned to his face. He agreed that I should take the game with me to my class so he couldn't play it. A week or so passed and he calmed down. He was having more issues sleeping now that he no longer had the game, but all in all, everything was fine. We would talk about books we had read or shows we had watched. It was nice to see that he started a normal life. Eventually, a mutual decision was made that he could continue playing, and he happily took the discs to the front room as I left. As the day wore on, I realized that I needed to go to a nighttime study session if I wanted to pass my exams. I called my friend to let him know that I would be home late, and he wished me good luck on my studying. A few hours passed and a storm picked up, causing me to be snowed in. I sent a text to my friend, knowing that the message would send when my phone finally got signal, and went back to my studies, which were now being done by candlelight. There was a moment of shock amongst the study group when the briefest of clear patches went over us, and the phones rung endlessly. Both annoyed and relieved by the disturbance of our studies, everyone paused to check their messages. I had 25 messages from my friend. The first was in reply to the message I had sent. "I just checked the weather and it looks like the storm will miss me. Haha. Hope the studying goes well." The rest worried me more and more with each message I read. Each time, he asked if he was being indoctrinated, if he was going to be okay. By the time he had sent the last message, he was just typing gibberish. There was only one message that I could make out. It said, "I can't believe that this is happening." I tried to call, but the phone rang endlessly. The storm picked up and I lost service. Panicked, pacing and shaking, I tried to explain that I need a ride to my home immediately. Only one person had a vehicle with four-wheel drive, and he said that the storm was too bad to leave. Once it cleared up, even a little, he would take me home. The time crawled by, mocking me, laughing as I paced endlessly, sneering as I begged it to hurry. My phone battery dwindled as I continuously called and texted, hoping and praying that I could find signal. Another break in the snow and I hurried to the parking lot. I tried to call my home or my friend's phone, but the stream of text kept interrupting the dial commands. I put on my seatbelt and finally managed to get a call through. The phone rang once before it lost signal again. With nothing else to do, I looked over the texts. Again, they degraded with each one sent. The most literate one said, "I can't believe it. They took me. How? I managed to withstand Arctic Yoshi. Why can't I fight them?" However, it was one from my mother that worried me the most. I had told her about my friend's new medication and that they were helping a bit. When I first relayed the information, she was happy that all was going well. The new text, however, chilled me more than the worst storm ever could. It read, "Honey, I tried to call you but your phone was dead. I called your house but it kept ringing. Your father heard something at work today. One of the doctors said that the medications your friend is on can have terrible side effects. There have been reports of patients on the medication relapsing, with some experiencing worse symptoms than when they had started taking the medication. Be careful and get your friend into the doctor as soon as you possibly can. I love you, darling." My breath caught in my throat and my stomach churned. Everything had been going so well. Why did it have to fall apart now? Why not after he'd finished the game? Hell, why not before he started the goddamn thing? I needed to get home. I had to get home. The truck's brakes squealed as they slid to a stop on the ice. I jumped from the car into a pile of snow. I tripped and stumbled as I fought against the wind, snow, and ice as I ran to my door. Though not normally a godly woman, I prayed that my friend was okay. I prayed that he was just pissed with the game as I was. I prayed that I hadn't been stupid, that I hadn't made a horrible mistake all those months ago. My numb fingers fumbled as I put the key into the lock. I pushed the door open and called for my friend. There was no response. I dropped my things in the entryway and ran into the main room. The television was on and the game sat, waiting for its player to return. I looked at the screen. I saw the game had been left during Shepard's third dream sequence. It sat idle at the moment that shows the strongest effects of the indoctrination on the main character. The shadows shifted on the screen, blurring in and out of focus. Whispers worked their way out of the speakers and through the house, hiding in every corner, waiting for someone to walk by them so they could work their way into the person's mind. Thunder roared and the lights dimmed. The television flickered, causing shadows to dance throughout the room. I swallowed and took a deep, rasping breath. In my heart, I knew what my mind didn't want to admit. Time seemed to slow. Every movement I made seemed to etch itself in time. My foot falls slightly louder than the booming thunder and whistling winds. I reached the hall and paused. To my right, I could see a dim light outlining my friend's bedroom door, his nightlight. As I continued down the hall, I called my friend's name. My words echoed endlessly off the walls. There was no reply to my call. I said his name again, louder. My body seemed to move itself towards the door. With a shaking hand, I reached for the door handle. The brass was cool to the touch. I hesitated. The man who drove me home called my name. He sounded worried and far away. I was numb. It may have been the winds and snow. It may have been the temperature of the house. It may have been the ice that had crept across my very soul. I opened the door with my gaze downward and stepped into my friend's room. I could hear a faint, steady dripping. I closed my eyes and took another breath. Deeper this time. I held it. As I released it, I opened my eyes and forced myself to look upwards. My scream was drowned out by the crash of thunder. That was the Reaper effect. Final thoughts? Absolutely fantastic. I have to say right off the bat, this is one of the best stories we've had on the show. Not only did we finally get a game that's fresh to the show, but it's one that takes place in the real world without relying on cliches and plot points that we've heard 1,000 times. The only plot point that we've seen before is a mentally ill person going crazy, but this plays out much more realistically, so I've got no issue with it. As long as it's done well, that's all that matters. The story was the perfect length for the plot it had, nothing felt like it was just wasting time, and I love how things like the storm are described in great detail, whereas the hanging wasn't even mentioned by name, just implied. It doesn't work in all stories, but it worked in this one. It feels like it plays into the character. I don't really have anything negative to say about the story, however I do have a comment on a plot point that I think could have been stronger. I wouldn't have had the mother inform the protagonist that the medication the friend is on had a bad side effect. That plot point rubs me the wrong way. It seems too convenient to me that the mother would hear about the side effect. What I would have done is mention in passing earlier in the story that the protagonist picked up the medication for him at the drugstore, then stopped by at the mother's house before going home. When the protagonist gets in the car and checks the text messages, they then find the one from their mother saying that they forgot his medication at her house. And in that moment, we realize that the friend was given the wrong medication. Whether that be his old medication or being accidentally given something that wouldn't help him at all, like acetaminophen, and let his mind go wild, I don't know. There's a lot of different ways you could go with that, and they're all pretty interesting. That's it for this creepypasta. Tune in again next Sunday when we tackle yet another video game creepypasta. If you want to write your own stories, help peer edit a story, or even just read the stories early, check out the description where you'll find a link to the creepypasta section of my forum. You'll also find a link to the playlist of every creepypasta rating I've done. If you're interested in keeping up with me on my blog posts, join the Facebook fan page linked below, and if you want to support me in what I do, check out my Patreon page in the description. Remember that if you want your story to be read on the show, you must stay active on your post on the forum, as well as read the forum rules. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, sweet dreams.